My name is Ann Coman. It is so great to have you all join us this morning. I hope you are ready to learn a lot about pruning and tree care. Pruning is so important to help establish good structure in young trees of many types. And you'll want to give your trees the best care possible to help them withstand the many pests and diseases that are attacking our trees these days. I hope you have your paper tree pruning exercise. So we'll be doing the pruning exercise right after Dr. Turney's presentation. If you haven't printed it out and you want to participate in the pruning exercise, we've put the link in the chat box. So click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen to open up the chat box and get your pruning diagrams. So Altadena Heritage is pleased to present this second tree workshop in a series of 3. These tree workshops are being held in conjunction with our tree giveaway program. I am pleased to share with you that we will be giving away 40 trees to applicants who have promised to care for them for at least 3 years. These trees will be distributed the first week of November, the ideal month to plant a tree. Our workshops and tree giveaway are made possible by a generous grant from Southern California Edison. I would like to mention that these workshops and tree giveaway and the new tree pages on our website could not have happened without our terrific tree committee. And I want to thank especially Janet Castro, Kathy Musial, Kathleen McDonald, Michelle Zach, and Mark Goldschmidt. And I want to thank Catherine Cadigan and Mark Hinson for designing our tree resources and giveaway website pages. They did a beautiful job. Now, a word about Altadena Heritage. We are a nonprofit community organization. Our mission is to preserve and raise awareness of the cultural, historical, architectural, and environmental heritage of Altadena. If you are not a member of Altadena Heritage, please consider joining and supporting the work that we do. It is easy to become a member online at altadenaheritage.org. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you of our third workshop, which will be held November 7th. The title of that is A Tree Planting Demonstration. You won't want to miss that if you are getting a tree. If you missed our first workshop, Right Tree, Right Place, you can go to our website to watch the video. So the outline of today's program is similar to what we did in our first workshop. We'll have Dr. Turney give a presentation, and that will be followed by our paper tree pruning exercise. And then Dr. Turney will go over at least one tree and show us how he would prune that tree. And then we'll have a Q&A period. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jerrold Turney. Dr. Turney received his BS in biology from California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, and his PhD in plant pathology from the University of California at Riverside. His PhD research focused on the biological control of Phytophthora root rot of citrus. After completing his PhD, he joined the Huntington Botanical Gardens as curator of the Camellia Gardens. In 1998, Dr. Turney joined the research staff at the Arboretum of Los Angeles County as a research horticulturalist. Dr. Turney joined the Department of Agricultural Commissioner for Los Angeles County in 2000 as a senior biologist, plant pathologist. He retired from that position in January of this year. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Turney was formerly a licensed landscape contractor and is currently a licensed agricultural pest control advisor and an ISA certified arborist. His primary fields of expertise are plant pathology, mycology, and arboriculture. Today, Dr. Turney will tell us all about pruning and tree care. Welcome, Dr. Turney. Take it away.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And today we're going to talk about the fundamentals of tree pruning. And so I have a PowerPoint. We'll go through that PowerPoint slide. Before we start with the PowerPoint, I'll just give you the guidelines for pruning mature trees are pretty straightforward. You can get them at the, if you go to the ISA website, they'll have this type of information. There's a great Forest Service guide to tree pruning. You can find it, just Googling, go to U.S. Forest Service tree pruning, and you'll find their guide. It's excellent. And some of the cartoons I use in the PowerPoint slide are from that publication. So, number one, you always prune to enhance the natural form. You avoid cuts over 2 inches. You don't remove more than 25% of the canopy in a single pruning. Never wound the trunk. You don't let people climb your trees with spikes and poke the trunk full of holes. And when you're removing a branch, if you've got a valid reason to remove an entire, like a scaffold branch, a large 4 to 6, maybe 10-inch branch, that's diameter. You need a compelling reason, and we'll go, how would you do that without harming the trunk? It's really critical. And of course, when trees are young, it's really critical to train them so they don't develop either codominant leaders, multiple branch attachment at the same point, narrow crotches, things like that. So we'll go over that. Let's just go to the PowerPoint slideshow. And where is it? Here it is. Oh, okay. So here we go, tree pruning.
Jerry, you need to stop your screen sharing and then go back into screen sharing and select the PowerPoint.
Okay. And do it again?
Yeah, go to screen sharing again and select your PowerPoint window.
How's that?
Better. That's it.
Okay. Prune to enhance the natural form. Avoid large wounds over 2 inches. And this may seem obvious. Always have a reason to remove a large branch, although over the years I've seen people cut off very large branches for no reason at all. Do not wound the trunk. No spikes. Do not let cut branches rip the bark. That's really important. Remove branches beyond the branch collar. We'll take a look at that. Limit removal of foliage to less than 25%. Often mature trees will only need light thinning of less than 10% of the greenwood. Prune when the tree is dormant. That's generally true, although that is not as important as the other elements here. Some people like to prune their trees when they're in full leaf. They think they can see the effect of the weight of the leaves, and it changes how they prune to some extent. But I always prune dormant trees, deciduous trees in the winter. But there's a lot of aspects of when to prune. We'll talk about that too. Remove branches to their point of origin. That's usually best. And we'll talk about the 2 types of cuts. Do not top or severely prune trees. The worst thing you can do to a tree is severely prune it. We've seen, and I'll show you lots of pictures. So let's first talk about the trunk and branch wood. So trunk and branch wood are different. When you're removing a branch, you do not want to flush cut. In the old days, people would cut right along here, leaving a very large wound and opening the trunk to decay. So when you're removing a large branch, this is the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. You always want to make the cuts beyond the branch collar. So when you remove a branch, you're going to make 3 cuts. And again, here's the ridges on the collars. Your first cut is just outside the collar, and it's about maybe a quarter to a third of the way into the branch. Your second cut comes along here, and the purpose of this cut is to prevent the branch from hinging and ripping the bark down the tree. As you cut here, you'll get to about here, and the branch will come off. It'll start falling off the tree unless it's a very small branch or you can hold on to it. And if you don't have this cut, it rips the bark. So you cut, and then you make a final cut just inside this cut, leaving a small nub just outside the collar. So here on this is a liquid amber tree, and I picked liquid ambers because they show the collar quite nicely. Here's your collar right here. If you wanted to cut this branch off, you'd undercut here a little bit, maybe about to here. Then you'd make a cut out here, and as you got to here, that branch would come off the tree before you finish your cut. Then you'd make a third cut like this to clean it up and leave a nice small, just about a half an inch, maybe up to an inch of wood just beyond the collar. This leaves the smallest wound. If you can imagine, if you made the cut here, you'd have a wound nearly twice the size of this cut. So it's really important not to flush cut branches up against the trunk. And here you can see the same tree that's had numerous branches removed from it. And this is what you want to see. This callus formation comes in and grows over the pruning wound and seals it. Now you're almost guaranteed over time, over 10, 20, 30 years, with all these branches cut off, you often get decay pockets where these old branches were. Now there's two types of cuts. There are heading cuts and thinning cuts. A heading cut is when you cut a branch back, not to its point of origin, but back either to a side branch or just to a bud. A thinning cut is here, where you remove branches entirely at their point of origin. You should try and use mostly thinning cuts and avoid heading cuts, although heading has its place, especially shortening very long branches that you think are oversized or you want to take weight off the end. That's the most common time you use a heading cut. The response to pruning is rapid new growth. You always have to remember that. The first response to pruning is rapid new growth. So when you whack a tree like this that got topped, there are dormant buds throughout the bark. And trees have what is called apical dominance. The top of the tree controls the growth of the whole tree. It's very strong in some trees, it's weaker in other trees. But when you whack off all these branches, just cutting them off willy-nilly, then all the buds that are dormant just below that cut break and grow, and you get 10, 20, 30 new shoots coming up on the edge. And those shoots are only attached to the very edge of the bark. And so they are weakly attached, and they tend to rip and fall off quite easily. If you come back in 5 years, 3 to 5 years after this type of pruning, a lot of these will have died out, and there'll be 3 or 4, maybe 5 that survived, and they're growing very rapidly. They're acting like separate trees in the canopy. And they're trying to get to be the tallest. They want to be the central leader. So this is, typical what you see often. This is tipping, where they've gone out and tipped the branches. Maybe that's, maybe these are small branches, 1 and 2 inches branches. Heading or topping, you often think of larger branches, 6 inches or larger. This is a jacaranda tree, and this has been headed back. And then, this is typical. These new shoots, these new branches grow rapidly, and you can tell they're young because they've got juvenile bark. Here's the mature bark. You see there, this is mature bark. This is juvenile bark. These are very young, only a couple of years old, but they're growing rapidly, and they're growing very fast, and they're only attached at the very edge. So in a high wind event, or even, not necessarily that severe high wind, this can rip and tear the bark down the tree. So, and especially if you wait years, these will get quite large. After 5 to 10 years, they may be 6 inches in diameter. And then the chances of ripping and falling are quite high. So why does topping hurt trees? It causes severe stress. The only source of food for the trees are their leaves or their needles and pines. If you cut off all the leaves and needles on a tree, then its first response is try and grow it back, because you're suddenly starving. That's very stressful for trees. When you severely prune trees, you open up the trunk to decay, and after 10 years, 20 years, you have decay pockets in the trunk or in the major staples. All the new branches will be poorly attached after severe pruning. You will definitely reduce the lifespan of a tree that's been severely pruned. And virtually the minute you do that, your tree is now a hazardous tree, and it often leads people to removing them entirely years later. Because you increase susceptibility to disease and insect attack when you stress trees with severe pruning. And of course, it makes the tree look more like a telephone pole with some of the worst cases. And I've seen just recently, a client of mine had topped her 2 Canary Island pines, and then within 6 months, one of them had died, and then 3 months later, the other one died. They were perfectly healthy trees, 75 feet tall. She cut them down to 30 feet. That's she cut the trunk off and removed 2/3 of the height of the tree. Well, that just killed the trees. So if she didn't want the trees, then she achieved her goal. This shows you what regular branches do, or how they're attached to the trunk. This branch is attached all the way to the middle of the tree. This branch is firmly attached. A little boy can climb on it, hang on it. It doesn't rip and break off, hopefully. But when you top a tree, the new growth will only be attached right here on the side of the bark. And that rips quite easily. So it's quite common. Now here's my horror. This is lemon scented gum, Eucalyptus citrodora, although I know it has a new genus. And these have been severely pruned for no reason at all. This makes no sense. These are tall, wispy trees that need little to no pruning. And in fact, they're next to tall buildings, which is appropriate for such a tall tree. Again, a tree that's been, butchered. Now you come back in a year, here's a little bit of growth here. Come back in a year and these trunks will be just covered with new growth because it's desperate. This is a different case. This is over thinning. So remember, don't remove more than 25% of the foliage in a single pruning. In this tree here, this is Magnolia grandiflora, the southern magnolia. This tree has been stripped of about 90% of its leaves. They've also made another mistake, which is called lion tailing. Well, and I'll show you that a little more clearly. Here's a eucalyptus tree. This is a street tree. Why? If you want to cut it here, the real place to cut it is down here. If this tree had that big a problem that it had to have this size of a cut in the main trunk, then it should have just been removed. This is a terrible way. This, in 10 years, this will be a very hazardous tree. This branch will get to be 6 inches, 8, 10 inches, and it's barely attached to the trunk. It's going to rip and fall off. Hopefully no one's standing nearby. So anyway, this is the ugliest tree you could have as a street tree anywhere in the world. More severe pruning. Here you've got a Chinese elm, and they tolerate severe pruning. This usually doesn't kill them. They break out and grow all their new growth again, but it's really, really bad for them. Here's another Magnolia grandiflora, severely pruned, headed back, over thin, and actually paid someone to do this to your tree. It's just horrible. Now, this is actually a Texas umbrella tree. I don't know if they were intending to remove this whole tree the next day, but when I drove by, this is how they've left it. This is just a horrible example. Giant cuts that are going to decay right down the trunk. And then they left themselves with a horribly asymmetrical tree. Olive trees headed back strongly. Now here's another problem. If you do this type of pruning, if you severely prune a tree and remove 95% of the foliage in a single pruning, and you do that in June, and then in July, August, September, it's hot, especially in the interior valleys like San Gabriel Valley, and the sun will come in and burn this bark, and that's permanent damage. Burned bark is permanent damage, and you can see here, this is a canker. This bark has been burned because this has been done repeatedly to this tree. This looks like a burn here. So some trees are very sensitive to sun on their bark, like avocado, but any tree that you open up to the full sun in the summer will probably get sunburn on the bark. Another Magnolia grandiflora, and why someone paid to have someone do this to their tree is beyond me. This is lion tailing. Lion tailing is when you strip all the foliage off the tree and leave a little clump at the end. Now, as the tree grows back, this grows rapidly and puts a lot of weight on the end, and it often results in what we call bow branching, where the branch bends. And then the other thing that'll happen is the sun will come in and hit this bark, and it'll stimulate the production of what we call water sprouts. Water sprouts are growth, new growth that grows straight up off a horizontal branch. They act like separate trees within the canopy. They don't respond to apical dominance. And when you're pruning, one of the first things you remove are water sprouts. Now, some trees water sprout like crazy, like lemons and jacaranda. Other trees, pines don't water sprout particularly. So it really depends on what you're pruning. But if you come back in a year or two, there'll be little shoots all along here on all of these, shooting straight up, acting like separate trees. So it disrupts the natural form of the tree. Let's go into training young trees. When you get your tree, often from the nursery, it will have been topped in the nursery. They'll just take, just make a little cut, a foot or two below the tip. And that makes it a little bushier. It stimulates the lower growth. But then you'll end up with 2 or 3 leaders. And so you only want one central leader on your tree. So usually if there's 2 or 3, you're going to pick the straightest one or the tallest one or the one that's mostly in the middle. And the other 2, you don't want, but you don't remove them immediately. What you do is you just pinch them, or you take your hand shears and just clip out about 1 inch of the tip. That will dwarf that codominant leader. And you come back in a year after the tree started to get established and grow, throw a lot of new growth, and you remove them entirely. If you don't tip them and you come back in a year, they're going to be quite a bit bigger and you're going to have a larger wound. So the reason you tip them is to dwarf them in anticipation of removing them in a year. So as your tree grows, you're going to want to select your scaffolds. In general, scaffolds should start about 10 to 12 feet above ground. Now, this is mostly for large trees. This isn't so much for something like a crepe myrtle or maybe a strawberry tree that only get to about 20 feet. This is really about trees that are going to be 40 to 50 feet tall. Now, of course, you can let your scaffolds be lower if you've got a very large lot and you've got the space for it and you don't need to walk under your trees. Most of the time, you want to be able to walk under your trees. Now, when you get your tree from the nursery, it's in the pot, there'll be small branches on the trunk. You want to retain these branches for the first year. So you leave the side branches on the trunk. But you don't want them to grow really big, so you tip them. That will again dwarf them, and then in a year you come back and remove them. Now, why do you want to keep them for the first year, maybe up to a year and a half or even 2 years? Is because they're shading the trunk and preventing sunburn on the trunk, especially on the south and west sides of the trunk. So, but you're going to remove them because they're too low. So you tip them, again, you take off 1 inch or 2 from the tip of the branches, you come back in approximately a year and you remove them entirely. So you prune off the ends of the side branches to stunt, remove side branches after 1 to 2 years. Staking is important. You stake for only 1 growing season or maybe up to a year and a half or 2. And it's important to remove the nursery stake. The nursery stake is tied right up against the trunk with plant tape. And if you leave that in there and plant your tree, then when the wind blows, the tree moves a little and that stick is rubbing on the trunk and will damage the trunk. So you don't want that right up against it. You want to remove that entirely. Even that plant tape where it's wrapped around the trunk will restrict the growth of the trunk. And that'll be a permanent weakness in the trunk. And if you leave it there for years, then the trunk gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you've got this constricted spot on the trunk. And if you get a high wind, it can break right there. And I've seen it happen. There was a row of Canary Island pines on Walnut and Lake, and they had left those stakes on for years. And then a high wind came up and snapped them all off right where that planting tape had been. So it does have real life consequences to leave those nursery stakes in. Remove them and stake properly. So training young trees. This is how you want your trees to eventually be. You want your scaffold branches to be distributed vertically and radially around the tree. You don't want them laying on top of each other. You don't want multiple branch attachment at the same point. So as the tree is growing, you're gonna, if you had another branch right here doing the same work, when it's young, when it's a 1 or 2 year old tree, you can take it off with your hand shear. Here, this is what we call bowl branching, where all these branches arise at the same point on the tree. For smaller trees, this probably isn't a big deal. For a crepe myrtle or a strawberry tree, that might be fine. But in general, I would still avoid developing what we call bowl branching. Over here, what you see are what we call a narrow crotch. When a trunk comes up and divides into 2 codominant leaders, and that's why you want to remove one of these. You don't want this on a 20, 30-year-old tree because half the canopy is going to be on each one of these branches. And if you cut it off now you end up with an asymmetrical tree. You can fix it quite easily when it's a young tree, but it's very difficult to fix on a mature tree. So now this is a U-shaped where you have codominant leaders. This is much safer than the narrow crotch with a V shape. If you can see a line running down between the two branches, that's called included bark. And that indicates that this is even more likely that one of these will rip off in a high wind because there's really no attachment between these two branches. The attachment here is much better, much stronger. Still, both of these are considered structural faults. This is just not as bad as a weak V-shaped unit. So when your tree is young, one of these should have been removed so that you have one central leader, and then you've got scaffolds coming off at a height. Now, this is an oak that was planted in South Pasadena as a street tree. They didn't tip these lower branches. Now, this is a situation where you really have to have your major scaffolds start at about 10 to 12 feet. The street's over here. If you let this tree branch just go and go and go, it's going to be in the street. You can't have that. And this is a parkway. You want to be able to walk under this tree. So when this tree was planted, this branch should have been tipped and then removed after 1 year. And so now you're going to come, and when you remove these branches, because they're going to have to be removed, you're going to have a larger wound than you would have had if you had dwarfed them at planting. Now the staking here is appropriate, except this lower tie is not necessary. And at this point, these stakes are no longer necessary. These stakes have been here more than a year. So these stakes should be removed because that tree certainly will hold itself up. As soon as the tree will hold itself up, you don't need the stakes. But you place one stake on two stakes opposite sides of the tree. You take a flexible material and you wrap it around the tree in a figure 8, or in this case, it looks like 2 separate pieces, but not too tight. You don't want the tree tied up so tight it won't move. You want it to bend a little in the wind. This stimulates growth, woody growth in the trunk, and makes the trunk stronger if it can move a little in the wind. And that really goes to why you remove the nursery stake, because that nursery stake doesn't let the tree move. If you don't put these stakes in and remove the nursery stake and just let it sit there for a year or two, and then finally come and take the nursery stake out, it may just flop over because it never strengthened the trunk. But, and this isn't really necessary because all you really need to do is stabilize the tree here. Generally, this is placed at about 4 to 5 feet. If you hold the trunk of the tree, at the point you can hold it and it stays straight is where you attach your plastic material. There's all sorts of things that are for sale. Now, these are Ficus microcarpa. These were planted and they weren't pruned, or nothing was done to them when they were planted. They were just planted and people walked away. This is in Alhambra. And so the trunk comes up. It had 2 codominant leaders. This one probably should have been removed when the tree was planted. Now you come back decades later and you've got this very large scaffold. The rule of thumb is a scaffold should be 1/3 the size of the trunk. This trunk looks about 3 feet. This looks about 2 feet. So it's about twice as big as it should be. The problem with this is these type of large scaffolds, oversized scaffolds, have a tendency to rip and fall off the trunk, especially in a high wind event. You can see that there's included this line here. This is a V shape, and there's a line right here. This trunk is poorly attached, or this scaffold is very poorly attached to the trunk, and this is a high probability of ripping and falling off the tree in the lifetime of the tree. Not necessarily in the next year or two, but at some point in the life of the tree. This one is the same situation, a very large major scaffold, only about 4 feet off the ground. This tree would be much safer, structurally sound, if this had been removed when the tree was very young. And you could have done it with a hand shear. Now, if you want to fix this, you'd have to cut it off with a chainsaw. You'd leave an enormous wound in the trunk. You'd lose about 1/3 to half the canopy. So actually, that's not even really possible to fix it at this point. Now you're kind of stuck with this tree in, being fairly a hazard. Both of these trees could be considered hazardous trees. Here's a jacaranda tree, and this is on a high wind event on a county owned or maintained street. And the public works had called me in to assist them after the high wind event. All the trees on the street were ripped up bad by the high wind, but this had occurred multiple times on the street. And right here is a rip. And we're going to take a closer look at that. Here's the rip. At some point in time, this large branch was broken off and ripped off the tree and tore down like this. They fixed it by cutting it right here. But this is decades old, 10, 15 years old, maybe. And this will never, ever seal up. And you will eventually get decay down here. And this will greatly shorten the life of the tree. So rips are some of the worst damage you can have happen to a tree because it just never heals. Now this tree is an oak in Eaton Canyon, and the Parks and Rec had asked. I think I was working at the Arboretum when I went over to Eaton Canyon to assist, and you can see that the trunk is hollow, and they had a lot of decay. You know, our California coast live oaks, as they age, they're pretty prone to decay, and it's often that they have a hollow trunk from heart rot. But when this tree grew, it developed two co-dominant leaders. They both became basically two separate trunks. And when this, I don't think it was even windy, and this ripped and fell off the tree, exposing the heart rot. You can see a little decay here too. If you have heart rot and decay and co-dominant leaders, then that's just a recipe for a rip and a fail. Now, if this had been in someone's garden or maybe a street tree, this tree would have to be removed entirely because it's got a very high risk of failing entirely. I mean, most of the trunk is all rotted out, but Eaton Canyon, they don't cut down their trees ever. So what they did was they took royal rocks, figured out where this tree would land if it fell, put a bunch of rock all out in a big circle to, for the landing site, and then planted a whole bunch of natives so no one would walk under it. So that's how you can address this particular hazardous tree, because I said, well, you should cut it down. They said, oh, no, we're not cutting it down. They didn't even clean up the branch that fell on the ground. That's for the school kids to watch decay over the next 100 years. This is bowl branching. Again, this is a silver maple, which, by the way, don't grow silver maples. They do very poorly in Southern California. They are very prone to decay. We don't get cold enough in the winter for them to go into full dormancy. I think that adds to them decaying. So here you can see a large branch that was removed. It's calloused over, but this is certainly a decay pocket. Here's another decay pocket. I've seen every old silver maple I see has extensive heart rot and lots of decay pockets. But so when this was a small tree, a young tree, the trunk came up, it had many co-dominant leaders and nothing was done about it. And now you've got what we call bowl branching. So it creates a bowl with all these limbs and you can't fix it. And it's a structural fault. Now this is what a tree in general should look like. This is in Sierra Madre next to the library. And the trunk comes up, the first major scaffold here, the second one is over here. They're distributed radially around the tree well. It's not too big. It's a pretty good sized scaffold, maybe a little oversized, but this isn't like building a house. It's a general guideline that this should be 1/3 the size of the trunk. It goes up, here's another scaffold, and then as you go up and the trunk gets smaller, and then you have the rest of your canopy. So I like to use this picture to show what a mature tree should look like. Now, if you had a scaffold here, you couldn't walk under the tree. And in general, especially in parks, most people's, a standard kind of a lot, most people want to walk under the tree. Staking, back to staking. This is how you stake, although again, this lower tie isn't really necessary. One stake on each side of the tree, a flexible material securing it to the two stakes, but not tight, loose. So the tree kind of bends in the wind a little. And then in 1 year, you should come back and be able to remove these. Here's a eucalyptus tree, and this is in South Pasadena, not far from my home. And at this point, obviously, the tree is holding up the stakes. But this green plant tape, when you remove these two stakes and remove this, you'll see that there's an area right under where it's been compressed. That is a permanent weakness in the trunk at that point. Look back here, you can see it there. If you get a really high wind event, this is where the tree will break, right here. So these have obviously been left on way too long, maybe 10, 15 years. Right? That's a big tree that still has to be staked. Now let's talk about when to prune. It really varies significantly based on what you're pruning. In general, you prune trees when they're dormant. So deciduous trees, that really means the winter. For a lot of our native trees, like coast live oak, they're summer dormant, but you don't want to prune them. I don't recommend pruning in July or August. Generally, for our like California coast live oak, you would prune it in September, October, November, December. Then you don't want to be pruning too close to February, because if you prune them right there in February, you stimulate a lot of new growth, and they're prone to powdery mildew. So that's the big issue with some of our oaks, is pruning right before their growth flush and stimulating extra growth flush and getting a powdery mildew problem. Spring flowering trees like Magnolia solanagiana, the saucer magnolias, you prune them after they flower. If you prune them before they flower, like in November and December, you're pruning off the buds that will flower in February. So you don't want to do that. You want to prune them right after they flower, and then they'll grow new growth through the summer, and then they'll have lots of flowers the following year. Summer flowering trees, you can prune in the winter because they produce their flowers on the new growth in spring. So if you prune them in the winter, or the fall or the winter, then you're not removing the buds. And that would be like Albizia julibrisson, the mimosa trees. They flower in about June. They're flowering on the new wood, not the old wood. And so it doesn't hurt them, in terms of seeing the flowers. You prune fruit trees when dormant in the winter. And that's particularly true of deciduous fruit trees, such as, the stone fruits, plums, peaches, nectarines, apples and pears. Pomegranate, you would prune it in the winter when it's dormant and there's no foliage on it. Now you've got your evergreen fruit trees like citrus and avocado, and some of your tropical trees. Well, you got to look at each one. In general, citrus, I treat it just like a shade tree. I remove all the dead wood from interior, and I just digress. You can remove dead wood at any time of the year. If you've got dead branches, you can remove them anytime. That doesn't matter. But avocados, it's really important to prune in the fall or the winter. And do not open up the canopy to full sun, so that the sun, if you hard prune or take a lot of wood out of an avocado, a lot of the green wood, right before summer, the sun's going to come in and just fry the bark, especially the tops of the horizontal branches. So always be careful when pruning avocado. Citrus, again, I would do it probably maybe, well, it depends on the citrus. If it were a navel, I'd prune immediately after harvest. And that way I wouldn't be removing the fruit. And you harvest in January and February. For the other, for the summer citrus, I might prune right after they produce their fruit in the summer, maybe the late fall. Prune new trees when planted to train them. That's really critical. So in general, that's when you prune. Now, let's just talk about how you prune a big old, mature 40, 50-foot tree. First, you can remove any dead wood that's in the tree. When I used to prune trees, I would climb to the top of the tree and work my way down. As I'm going up, I might be removing dead wood and water sprouts. And remember, water sprouts are the vertical shoots off of horizontal branches. Then you get to the top of the tree and you start looking, you should already have an idea how you want to prune the tree by just looking into the tree from the ground. But you remove crossing branches that do this, that lay on top of each other and cross. And I would take one branch and move it, and move the other branch and decide which one I want to retain. If there are some large branches that are too long, they may be blocking a sign, blocking lighting. They're just so long you're afraid that they're too heavy and they're going to rip off the tree. Then you can do what is called drop crotch pruning, or heading back the branch to a side branch. And again, the rule of thumb is 1/3 the size of the branch you're cutting. So if you're heading back a 3-inch branch, you cut back to a 1-inch branch. And it's called drop crotch pruning. you drop back to a crotch and prune there. That's to reduce the growth response from pruning. The first response to pruning is rapid new growth. So you want to minimize that. And a lot of this is about minimizing the growth response. That's why you only take out 25% of the greenwood. That's why you prune when the trees are dormant. And so when you do this drop crotch pruning, you prune back to a side branch. Don't leave a big nub sticking out and then a side branch here. You prune back to the side branch. And then you want to prune for symmetry, which means, a lot of times trees have grown. There may be another tree close by. And so you have co-dominant canopies. The canopies are intermingled. And one of the trees has most of its foliage and most of the canopy is on one side of the tree. So you're going to kind of focus on removing wood and growth from that side of the tree so that you end up with a more symmetrical tree. You always want a tree with good symmetry. So kind of equal, that the foliage and the canopy is equally distributed around the tree. And then always have a reason to remove a large branch. Don't just think, oh, I don't, I've seen this so many times. On a variety of occasions, I've gone out with homeowners and the crews that are pruning the street trees. And the street tree people have removed very large scaffold branches on the trees. And you say, well, why did you remove that scaffold branch? It's an 8-inch branch. And they have no reason. They just can't tell you why at all. And the real reason is it shouldn't have been removed because there was just no reason to remove it. If you've got a good reason, yes, you remove large branches. If they have a decay pocket in them, they're broken in a windstorm, they're blocking a sign, they're blocking lighting, they're blocking walking under the tree. Now, the other thing to remember is when you're done pruning the tree, you want to have what's called the 1/3 to 2/3 balance, which means the lower 1/3 of the tree can have no branches and the upper 2/3 of the tree has branches. If you do 1/2, where half the trunk has no branches, and then the rest of the tree has branches, you've shifted the weight of the tree to the top of the tree. And then in windstorms or in high wind events, that makes it more likely to fail in the wind. So always have, this 1/3 to 2/3 balance. Now let's take a look at some trees and talk about how I would prune this particular tree. This is a liquid amber with great color. Unfortunately, liquid ambers are dying now from bacterial leaf storage, so it's not a recommended species to plant anymore. Here in South Pasadena, we've lost hundreds of them, and really virtually throughout the San Gabriel Valley and all of Southern California, they're dying everywhere. But you can see this trunk comes up and it separates into two basically vertical trunks. This one is already quite a bit smaller than this one. Here's your central leader right here, but this is a problem. Now, I don't know that I would want to make a big wound and whack this whole thing off. First off, that would result in an asymmetrical tree. You'd be removing maybe 1/3 of the canopy with one cut. So I would go up, but I don't want this branch to get a lot bigger. I want to dwarf this branch. And remember, tipping branches, heading them, dwarfs them. I would probably make a cut right in here just to, or just to stop this branch from getting much bigger. And that will help this shoot up because this is right now, this is about 25 feet here. This tree is maybe 30 feet to 35 feet, and it's going to eventually hit 75 feet. Liquid ambers can get to 50 to 75 feet, and 75 is more common. And so if you remove this, make a cut here, dwarf it. Maybe this one's getting a little big. I might come out and take a little bit off of this, and then a little thinning, removing crossing branches that start on one side of the tree and come out the other side of the tree. Those are branches. Any water sprouting. This tree doesn't need a lot of pruning. I would probably limit my removal of foliage or greenwood to about 10 to 15%. And it's still a young tree. This is not a mature tree, it's still a young tree. So training here, even though when this was planted, this should have been removed. So you only had one central leader. It's still young enough you can fix this to a large extent. Here, of course, is a terrible example of pruning. They've headed it back and they keep heading it back. This looks more like a quote rack than a tree to me. Fruit trees. Let's talk about pruning fruit trees. The open center system. This is used on the stone fruits. So almond, apricot, cherry, nectarine, peach, plum. And that's when you remove the central leader. So you plant your peach tree and it's got one central leader. you just whack it off at about 3 or 4 feet. And then the branches below, you want to establish 4 large scaffold branches on your peach tree. Maybe 5, 4 or 5, maybe only 3. But you don't want a central leader. You remove the central leader, and then you've got these scaffold branches, and you have an open center. That allows the sun to come in. It'll give you better fruit production, and it gives better air movement. Now on apples, pears, Asian pear, you use a central leader system. You retain the central leader, and you're going to have rings of branches that are distributed. On the first ring of branches, we'll probably have 4. The next ring up, maybe a foot or 2 up, we'll maybe only have 3, and you don't want them overlapping. You want them spaced so they're not over each other. And then you might have a 3rd tier at the top. So you have these tiers of branches on apples, pears, Asian pear. There are modified central leader systems with a delayed open center. You let it grow and you remove it later. And that's used often on persimmon and walnut. There's also what you call the fruit bush system, where you don't let your trees get much bigger than about 6 feet, and you have multiple small branches, and you have a lot of, it makes it easier to pick the fruit. This is not how I grow my trees. I use open center, and that's how, so open center, this, again, apricot, cherry, fig, nectarine, center kept free of large branches, sunlight reaches lower fruiting branches. So the first season, select 3 or 4 branches for primary scaffolds, pinch back all other upright shoots 4 to 6 inches. So the primary scaffold should be spaced several inches apart vertically and around the trunk. You want a 45-degree angle of attachment is best. Avoid flat or horizontal branches. So if you've got flat or horizontal branches, don't select those to be your scaffold. Again, cherry, plum, and pear have a tendency to grow upright, but pear actually you don't typically use open center. Plums really grow upright. They have a tendency to grow straight up, and it'll grow up, it'll grow a branch, and it'll grow straight up. So when on my plum, what I've done is I'll take a spacer, a piece of wood, and put it between the central leader and the side branch and force it to grow more horizontal. So that's, you put a little piece of wood in there, like sometimes people use a clothespin. The other thing you can do is you can tie a string to the end of the branch and tie a weight to it and pull it down so it's not so vertical. Apricot, peach, now I know no one probably is growing almonds. They tend to be more spreading and it's easier to get horizontal branching. Allow 2 to 3 secondary branches from the primary branch. So here you have this cartoon showing how you create an open center fruit tree. Here's your tree when you plant it. You just cut it off. Then it starts throwing a bunch of branches. You're going to select which ones you want to keep. So you're going to keep this one, you're going to keep this one, and you're going to keep this one. This one gets removed, and now these become your primary scaffolds. In this case, there's 3. You might have been able to keep 4 on certain trees. So this was bare root, tree headed after planting, growth after 1 season, a tree pruned after 1 growing season to develop your major scaffold. That's best for peaches, nectarines, apricot, and plum. So central leader, you develop a strong central leader, the lateral branches arranged in tiers, remove co-dominant leaders in spring, tie or stake scaffolds outward at 2 to 3 feet, just above horizontal. During the first dormant season, when the central leader is 2 to 3 above, first tier, head back to create a new tier. So that central leader is growing, you've got a tier of branches, it gets a little taller, you tip it. That's going to force new branching right below where you tip it. That's going to be your second tier. Then you're going to have a central leader again, and you're going to tip that again to get your third tier. Train second set of 4 branches outward. These branches should be offset by first tier. That means don't have them overlapping. Have them like this. Allow most vigorous shoot, the new shoot, to become the new leader. Repeat for next tier. Maintain pyramid shape or pyramidal shape by keeping lower branches longer than upper branches. So here is the cartoon showing you how to do it. A, the bare root tree at planting time. B is bare root trying to first tier of scaffold branches. So you put these spacers in and force these branches down and get a tier of branches. And then you remove the central leader and create another tier. And then you end up with 1, 2, 3 tiers. This is best for apples and pears and Asian pear. Fruit bush, this is a little different. First pruning in April or May, shoots 2 feet long, cut new growth in half. Second pruning in late June, cut new growth in half. This is going to make a very bushy tree. Remember that at the tips of every branch and at the top of the tree, you have what are called apical meristems. That's the tip, that's the growing point. That's how the tree gets longer and taller. That tip is growing, getting longer. If you tip it, if you cut it off, the buds behind it break and start to grow. So if you're trying to make a hedge and you've planted, a row of waxleaf privet or whatever hedge you want to do, and they're growing up, and you come and shear it, and then those buds break, and you get a thick screening canopy. Your hedge is, most people grow hedges for screening, for privacy in their backyard. And the way you make them thick so no one can see through them is by shearing them. So we use trees to do this. We use ficus, like Ficus benjamina, even Ficus hypercarpa. We use waxleaf privet and Eugenia. Those are the really common ones. I've seen strawberry trees grown as a hedge too. Well, when you tip trees, when you cut off the tips of branches, it causes the buds below or behind that cut to break, and then you get a lot more shoots. And that's what you're doing here with the fruit bush too. You cut the new growth in half and all the buds break. You cut it in half again. Third pruning if new growth vigorous, thin branches at top to let in light. Continue in second year until 5 to 7 feet tall. So this is an example of a fruit bush where you just keep cutting all the new growth in half. You end up with about a 6 or 7 foot fruit tree that's very thick and bushy. And if you don't have the space for full-size fruit trees, because generally you space your fruit trees at about 10 feet apart, and they take up a lot of space, a full-size fruit tree. So you can use dwarf or semi-dwarf, or you can go with fruit bush to try and have more fruit trees in a smaller space. If you got plenty of space, you don't have to do that. Now, I just want to mention that the fire blight and how to prune for that. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that you see in apples and pears. We see it in our flowering pears, like Pyrus kawakami and the other pyrus that we grow here. Now, there are some great apples to grow here too, like Beverly Hills, Gordon, Anna. Those are excellent low chill apples that do quite well in Southern California. But the pears, the flowering pears, they flower in the spring, but all of these are subject to fire blight. And you'll recognize fire blight because about 2 feet on the end of a branch dies. And so you get these dead branches scattered throughout the whole canopy. This is only a problem in wet springs. When the tree flowers and if it rains, then that's perfect conditions for the disease, for fire blight. And the fire blight gets into the flower, it starts in the flower, the bacteria gets on it, it splashes on from cankers in the branches or from bees. Bees get the bacteria on them, they visit the flower is infected, the bacteria grows down the pedicel of the flower into the twig, down the twig, into a branch, then it girdles the branch and everything beyond that point dies. And so you end up with a 2 to 3 foot length of branch that's dead. And so we call that flagging. So you want to remove all the infected wood when you prune a pear or an apple that has fire blight, but don't prune just below the dead wood. You prune 12 inches below the canker or the dead wood. Now, if you're not familiar with a canker is infected wood, either from a fungus or a bacteria in trees and shrubs, in woody hosts. And so they'll, in this case, in the spring, they start oozing and bleeding a black sap. It's filled with the bacteria, it splashes onto the flowers, the bees get it on them. So what do? Well, as soon as you see a dead branch, it's clearly fire blight, you prune 12 inches below the dead wood. If you're pruning in the spring, you need to clean your shears with Lysol or alcohol between cuts. don't get the bacteria on your cut. The reason you're pruning 12 inches below the canker is because this bacteria tends to run in a thin strip down the branch. It may be dead here, but the bacteria is actually all the way down to maybe 10 inches below that. So you cut it 12 inches. You want to cut through all white wood, no dead brown wood. And then make sure that you are cleaning your shears between cuts. That's not as important in the summer. It's very important in the spring. Prune out dead branches quickly when they appear in spring and summer. For commercial apple production, as soon as they see a dead branch, they remove it. They don't wait a second, because this is the major disease for apples and pear production, especially in Washington, Northern California, Oregon, where they grow a lot of apples and pears. If you let that branch, that infected wood, is the source of the inoculum to get more infections. So if you want to control fire blight in apples and pears, you've got to get those dead branches out as soon as they appear. That's really critical. Avocado, again, I mentioned this before, prune in late fall, early winter, so you don't expose the bark to sun in summer. Pinch terminals when young to produce short, bushy tree. Select a central leader and allow to grow desired height if you want a large single trunk tree. And now, generally speaking, fruit trees, you don't really want them to get more than about 15 feet tall, max. Because if you let an avocado get to 30 feet, then all the fruit's going to be up around 25 feet, 20 feet, and that's hard to pick. So commercial groves are never allowed to get much taller than about 15 feet. And that's why, generally speaking, you want to keep all your fruit trees between 12 to 15 feet for ease of picking. The whole concept of the fruit bush is to make it easier to pick the fruit. And now I'm going to show you a tree failure that was at Nucio's nursery in Altadena. Here's a eucalyptus tree, maybe a blue gum or something. When it was a young tree, it had 3 codominant leaders, and they were probably only a foot or 2 off the ground. No one bothered to pinch out 2 of them and let one grow straight. So you ended up with this bowl branching. On top of that, this is an old tree. You can see all this decay here, all this fungal decay, and a hollow trunk. Now, you don't know that that's hollow unless there's things that tell you that. But this trunk here just collapsed and fell with no wind. And I don't know if you're familiar with Nucio's, but here's Tom Nucio. He lives on the crop property, an old friend of mine. And you can see how large this branch was. And they're lucky that it didn't hit someone or hit a car and crush it. It might have done a little damage to this car, but not much. But the rest of that tree, then almost here, you got to remove it. It's just too dangerous. Those other branches are going to fall too, and people are under them all the time. You can see they grow their nursery. These are their azaleas, but you can see the decay here. Now, how do you know if your trunk has decay? Well, you look, I'm showing you this picture again. Here's a heart rot and a lot of decay. But how do you know that? Oh, by the way, someone sent me this picture, and he heard this cracking noise in his yard and went out, and his tree was just cracking and splitting. It probably had torque. It was bending, and it just, so this tree had to be removed immediately. It's I've never seen this before. The first time I'd ever seen it. Look at that. Spectacular. This is a crepe myrtle that's had weed whacking constantly. When you plant new trees, especially in a parkway or in a lawn, which in general, I don't recommend you grow your trees in lawns. Lawns need to be watered frequently, 2 or 3 times a week. Trees, once established, once they're old and established, are watered once a month in the spring and the fall, and up to every 2 weeks in the summer. In general, trees they're not compatible with lawns because lawns have a completely opposite watering needs. This has been weed whacked with a string trimmer repeatedly. This strips the bark off the bottom a little bit each time. You end up with a severely damaged tree, and these trees often just die. But you can put a tree guard on here and then strip the lawn away from it, so you don't have to do that. There's all sorts of products you can just, they have these thick mats that you can put down that'll suppress the weeds. Now this is probably a Western sycamore, and these are what you call conchs, or shelf fungi. This is the sexual fruiting body of the fungus, just like a flower on a bush. And the fungus is inside the tree, decaying, hollowing out the trunk. And then it produces these on the out. This is Ganoderma applanatum, or the artist palm. When you see this, especially this extensive, you know the middle of this tree is hollow and it's leaning. So, and it looks like it's even starting to slough some bark. Look here, there's some sloughing bark. All of this tells you you have a very dangerous tree. So most likely this tree, and I don't recall when I took this picture, or if someone even sent it to me, but this tree is going to come down in a wind or come down with no wind at all, probably in the next 10 years. Maybe it'll be there in 10 years, maybe not. But you can see there's a street out here. This is a sidewalk here. This is probably a fairly high traffic area, relatively speaking. And so this kind of tree almost certainly just has to be removed. This is a eucalyptus tree in Santa Monica. You've got a canker here, and the bark is sloughing and it's leaning. Another candidate for removal. And then my last picture is how not to prune a palm tree. Now I'm just going to briefly talk about palms, but this is of course ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, it's hilarious. How do you prune palms? You prune palms like a clock. Think of a palm tree canopy like a clock. So here's your clock, and you're going to remove the dead fronds below 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and you're not going to prune above 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock. This is terrible for this tree. When, basically removed all the foliage except a couple little pieces. And as this tree grows and gets taller, this is a Washingtonian prolifera. They get to about 100 feet tall. As it grows, now it will not make enough food to make a full-size trunk. So you come back in 10 years, and this tree will come up like this, then it'll get smaller, and we call that a pencil trunk, and then it'll get bigger. And that constricted little spot in the trunk on this tree is going to be right here. So you don't remove the green fronds from palms. You only concentrate on the brown fronds and remove them from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock below. There are some really good videos on YouTube that show you how to prune properly. So you go to YouTube or you go just to Google and you type in pruning palm trees. You can find lots of videos on how to correctly prune palm trees. There's also a really good video from the University of Massachusetts Fruit Tree Advisor, and they've got lots of videos actually. And go to YouTube, type in pruning peach trees, and find the one on pruning peach trees from the University of Massachusetts Fruit Tree Advisor. It's 5 minutes with a Beethoven soundtrack, and it shows you exactly how to prune the fruit trees, the open center technique. They've got the same ones for pruning apples and pears from the University of Massachusetts Fruit Tree Advisor. I used to use those when I had my garden TV show. So that's my my talk on how to prune fruit trees.
Thank you, Jerry. That was great. Thank you.
I don't know how much time I used up, but
we're at 5 after 11. We're good.
okay.
So now we're going to move to the pruning exercise, the paper pruning exercise. So we'll allow 5 to 6 minutes for that, and we'll come back and have you review how you would prune one of these paper trees on paper. So I will just let you go ahead, and I'll just play a video of tree pictures, and then we'll come back in 5 to 6 minutes. All right, see you then.
Okay.
So I'm gonna share screen, and here. Okay. Let's see if that goes. All right. So time's up. So Jerry, are you ready to show us how to do it, how to prune these trees or one tree?
Sure. Let me pull them up. Let's see. Thought I had it right here.
It was another PowerPoint, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, I have it right there. So I thought if I did share screen, it should be here.
do you need to, did you close your presentation PowerPoint?
I thought I had, yeah. Just close it. Okay. See if it works this time. There it is. So let's just take a look at some of these. Bring this one up. And okay, let's take a look at this. This says here that it's 6 feet right here. Now, it depends on what kind of tree this is, on how you want to prune it. If this is going to be a real small tree, like maybe a red bud, then you might even decide to leave some of these lower branches. But if this is going to turn into a 40-foot tree, generally speaking, you want these lower branches to not be there eventually. So what you do is you just either, you cut it here. You might just cut it here. You might even cut it here. You want to leave these side branches on. Again, you might take this off right there. And then maybe right there. This is for a newly planted tree. Come on. There we go. I might also, shorten this one, because anything below 6 feet, come on. Well, it doesn't want to draw a line there. But you can see what I'm doing. I'm not removing these branches entirely, because I'm going to come back in a year and cut it off here. But that's not for today. That's not the day you plant it. Now, generally speaking, even a 15-gallon pot tree is not going to be 6 feet tall, or it might be just 6 feet tall. So typically your tree is only going to be about this tall, and you're going to come up and have maybe 2 or 3 liters. Let's take a look at another one.
Oh, Jerry, wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Jerry, could you explain why you took off the one branch at the very top?
Because I want this to become the central leader.
Which one? Oh, I see. Okay.
So
and that was a competing leader.
And this is going to end up over time as 2 big trunks.
Okay.
So I want this one, and I want my first scaffold to be, actually, if this is going to be in my backyard, and I want to be able to walk under it eventually, I'm going to want the first scaffold to be starting up here. There's nothing on this tree that's going to be there in 30 years except the central trunk. So depending on what this is, and, it's a cartoon. I mean, you could potentially even cut that off. Well, I'd have to go back up.
And also the next cut down. So you have a V, and it looks like you have 2 equal size branches in the middle of the tree. You have 2 equal size branches. Yeah.
Is again, because this is going to be my central leader eventually.
Okay.
And undo, we'll get rid of them all. Let me, how do I get rid of them? I erase them?
How do you, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Well, because I wanted to bring up another tree and they don't go away.
Oh, they don't go away with, oh, okay.
Yeah, if I call up this tree now. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Let me just close that and call up this tree. Okay, this one's a little different. Again, here's the 6-foot mark. And I guess I got to turn this on each time separately. So here's the 6-foot mark. If this is going to be, now this looks like it has pretty strong, the other one didn't look like it had real strong apical dominance. Something like maybe a Chinese elm or even coast live oak. The reason you get that big canopy, umbrella-shaped canopy, is because the apical dominance isn't as strong as something like in a Canary Island pine, which has very strong apical dominance. So this thing's taken off, it's growing straight up. Here's 6 feet. Every one of these has to be, dwarfed when you plant it, just to like this. So all of these are going to be nipped or tipped. Somewhere in there you're gonna. I guess my mouse doesn't work very good. Now this one is clearly not good. This should be tipped. This should be tipped. Maybe even, depending on what these are, this is, and you're only taking off a few inches, because this is a small tree. And now you're going to want this to turn into your tree. This is going to be your tree right here. Nice and vertical, really nice. And this is a street tree too. So if you just leave this branch and let it grow out into the street, well, then you're forced to cut it off, and this is much bigger. The reason you nip it like that is to dwarf it and then come back in a year and remove it. Now, it may take 2 years because you want this to come up and develop a canopy up here and shade the trunk. The ones on the north side, you could probably take off earlier. The ones on the south and west sides are where you get the most burn. You don't want to strip all these off when you plant the tree, because then in the afternoon, on July, August, the sun's going to come in and fry that bark. So you have to leave them on for the first year or two, but you want to dwarf them.
So Jerry had a question. If 2/3 up the tree, there's like 2 branches coming out from the same
That's
point
right.
on the trunk. And let's say I wanted to scaffold only up to 6 feet because it's a small tree. I would have to remove one of those, right? Or not?
Maybe. Again, working with a caricature or a cartoon like this is a little different than having the tree right in your hand and, holding the tree.
Yeah.
The way this is drawn, on a small tree, like a strawberry tree, I wouldn't worry about that too much. On a big tree, I'd probably remove these entirely anyway, because it's the 6 foot mark.
Okay,
But on a strawberry tree or a red bud or something like that, that's, small trees, the problems are small. You don't get 8-inch, scaffolds on a red bud. The biggest scaffold you got on a red bud is about 3 inches. So because, the trunk only gets to maybe 8 inches, so small trees are more, it's very fine pruning. It's small cuts and shaping the tree and opening it up. I was looking at the pictures you showed there, and those strawberry trees, take a look at them. You'll notice there's no scaffolds up to about 8 feet. They're in the parkway. People can walk under them. You pull up your car and open the door and step out onto the lawn. And you can walk under those trees. So in certain locations, that's really important. Now, if you've got a big estate, you got an acre or two, and you can be more like a park. And like the deodar, you had a picture of a deodar in front of someone's home. You notice there's no really low scaffolds on that tree because they would make it impossible to walk by the tree. So the first major scaffold starting at about, a little low, might have been about 8 feet. But, where is the tree? What is your goal? At the Huntington and a lot of parks, you'll see those deodars with big scaffolds at about 4 feet, and they sweep down and they stick out 15 feet. They're gorgeous. They're beautiful. But for most people, you don't want to lose that much of your yard to one tree. You want to be able to walk under it, maybe put some, have a scaffold start at 10 or 12 feet. And then you can even put a table and chairs and sit under your tree and enjoy the evening. But let's see. I'll just pull this one up. Do this. I've noticed that if I leave these red marks, they stay even though you pull up the other one.
Oh.
Come on. I'm getting better at it. So I'll show you what I mean. Now, if I go over here, I'll just close that, and I open this up. Come on. See, my red mark is still there.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I'm sitting there erasing them. Erase this one. Yeah. So I just want to take a look at these three. Here, this is 6 feet. Again, this is a bad problem. If you get a tree like this, it already has these codominant leaders. This is a problem. If it's still a small tree, if this is 6, this might be only 10 feet tall. And so if this is a tree that's only going to get to 15 to 20 feet, I might not address this issue because it's a small tree and it's not that big a deal. But if this is a tree, if this is a Magnolia grandiflora that's going to get to 50 to 75 feet, I don't want a major scaffold like this starting at 3 feet above the ground. I may cut it off here. I might cut it here. It's not cooperating. Oh, there we go. Well, I might, make that cut right there. And because now, this is a pretty wide, separation between the two trunks, because this is coming up to one trunk separating into two. I don't want that on a big, large tree. I would probably, either cut it off, here or cut it there. And then I might, nip some of these a little bit. That's not a good branch to have. You don't want branches that are going straight down. This one's too low. It depends on, I might cut it a little farther out to leave it so it grows some foliage. This one, I don't know, is this a decurrent tree? It's acting it looks funny. So you might be cutting this here because that's not this branch coming off like that's not good. You would probably nip that, let this become the central leader. And then that's a funny shape, and then all these are just going to be nipped or then you're going to come back in a year and remove them entirely. Because here's your 6 foot mark. So that's kind of how I would approach all these 4 that you have here. And erase all that stuff.
Okay, great. Okay. Thanks, Jerry.
It's different for every tree and every species, because when you get it from the nursery, they are not all the same. But be careful of when you're training young trees, when they're first planting them, you're not taking off a lot of leaves. You don't want to be removing all the leaves because they need every leaf on them, really. Those leaves feed the trunk on the side branches. So you're just making little cuts with your hand shears or pinching the tips of branches. You can come back in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and you're seeing the growth and you're saying, oh, I don't want that. The ultimate art of pruning is bonsai. Bonsai, you take a tree that can get to 75 feet and you grow it and it's only 12 inches. So how do they do it? Well, every 3 months they go clip, 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 and they're done. And then clip a few months later, they're always taking little tiny cuts. And they use wire to force branches to grow the way they want them. But they don't let the tree get to 20 feet and then try and turn it into a bonsai because that doesn't work. So in a way, you can take any tree you want. And when it's young, you can force it to be a small tree. Now, that's not smart in a way. I mean, if your landscape, pick a small tree. Why would you pick a 50-foot tree if you only want a 20-foot tree? So pick a 20-foot tree and it makes life a lot simpler. But you want to, envision, the central trunk. What is going to become your central leader, your central trunk? What's going to become your scaffolds? Now, you're picking your scaffolds might not come for several years, because if you put in a 6-foot tree, typically in those 15-gallon and 5-gallon pots, your trees, when you plant them, they're only as tall as you. So maybe 6 feet tall, 7 feet tall. Virtually all those branches, when the tree is mature, they won't be there anymore. And what is natural for all these big trees is as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, the interior branches that are shaded out, they die. That's why you have deadwood inside the canopy. Only if it costs more in energy to sustain a branch than the branch is making in energy, then that branch will be shaded out and die. So especially in citrus, you look at an old orange tree that hasn't been pruned, the interior is filled with deadwood. So the first thing you do is you start clipping out all the deadwood, and then you start to see the structure of the tree. Then you start thinking, well, here's a crossing branch, remove that. Here's another overlapping branch, fix that. And then you can always stop and think about it for another month or two, and then come back and do a little pruning here. So frequent small pruning is really good, especially for the smaller trees. And of course, as your trees age and they mature, you know, a large mature oak, 50-year-old, I think you're pruning it maybe every 10 years, especially if it's in a dry landscape and it's not got a really high growth rate. If you're irrigating your oaks, and hopefully not more than once a month, and mostly in the winter and in the spring, then you'll have a higher growth rate, and you might have to be pruning and shaping the tree every 5 years. If it's close to your home, if it's touching the roof, that's going to stimulate you to prune a little more often. If it's at the back of a 150-foot lot, and you can let it just go. To, you know, I mean, you shape it and you thin it, but you don't have to address it constantly. So, you know, carefully space your trees, pick your trees, put the right tree in the right spot, which is the last thing we talked about. But I don't know. So do you want to open up to questions? What do you want to do?
Yes, let's go. There are a lot of questions in the chat already. So here's one. How do we find a company that will prune trees accurately, and can Palo Verde trees be pruned? I hear they just don't like it and branches will die quickly. So that's two questions from.
Okay. The first question is how to pick a tree service. You always want to get a tree service that has either a certified arborist on staff or certified tree workers. So the International Society of Arboriculture is the certification agency. It's a business certification. It's not a state license or a local government license. I'm an ISA certified arborist. And you want to see, the other thing is when you call them in and you talk to them and they say, oh, we'll top your tree. Well, then you don't hire them. Anybody who's willing to top a tree should not be hired. That means they really don't know anything about trees. There's lots of very, very good tree services. You can go to the ISA website and put in your zip code and look for companies that have certified arborists or certified tree workers. And a certified tree worker has to climb, when they get their certification, it's not easy. You got to climb the tree in a certain time period. You've got to rescue a dummy out of the tree who's injured. They make you do all this stuff. You got to show you can use your ropes and saddles properly. The other thing, are they willing to, do they want to climb your tree with spikes? Get rid of them. They should use ropes and saddles. They should be able to provide you with documentation that they've got liability insurance. Typically, a tree service or a landscape contractor is going to carry a $1 million liability insurance policy. The insurance company will send you a card documenting their insurance. Make sure they got workers' compensation insurance. There are a lot of people out there with a pickup truck and a chainsaw. They are totally working under the table. They're people, they don't pay taxes. I'm not condemning them at all. I'm just saying they're out there. If you're cutting down a tree and you just want to cut down and it's not a difficult removal, maybe that's the people you want because it'll save you a lot of money. But if somebody gets hurt on your property, you might be in trouble. So be careful about hiring people that don't have workers' comp, that don't have liability insurance, and that don't have trained people who know what they're doing. And maybe you ask them, are you familiar with the ISA guidelines on tree pruning? They should know what you're talking about. Then the other question, pruning Palo Verde. Oh yeah, you can prune them, but they are small, wispy trees. They need very little pruning. I don't know that I'd be heading back a lot of the branches, but I'd be doing some thinning cuts. But that's a tree that needs very little pruning. But you do want to train it when it's a young tree, just like you would train any young tree. So, you're going to, but on that, you might have scaffolds starting at 3 or 4 feet. You might have, it's only going to get to about 15, 20 feet max. So, and they're wonderful trees and they're very light and wispy. Same thing like on a Eucalyptus citrudora. They're tall, wispy trees. They don't need a lot of pruning. Just removing dead wood, maybe fixing codominant leaders or narrow crotches. But you don't go up and do what the pictures I showed you, would you head it back everywhere and just wreck the tree. And I know years ago, my brother hired someone to prune his liquid amber tree. And they're out there working on it. And my nephew walked out, who had worked on trees with me. And they were just cutting the whole tree back to nubs, 8-inch nubs. And he stopped them halfway through. He said, don't do that, So you got to, make sure you're on the same page with whoever you hire. A lot of times, and this is true for almost anything you hire anybody to do around your home, make sure that what they're doing is what you want them to do. So you talk about how they're going to prune the tree. You say, listen, I just want it thin. I don't want any large cuts. And hopefully they understand where you're coming from. And don't hire people who don't have any training at all.
Thank you. Jerry, here's another question. I want to plant a fig tree and train it to have a wide canopy. Should I plant multiple trees close to one another or allow the fig to develop multiple shooters at the ground level? Which brings me to the question also of what about multi-trunk trees? There are some trees, including trees in our giveaway list, that have a tendency to form multiple trunks. What can you tell us about that?
Well, multi-trunk trees are very popular with designers. They like they look good in the landscape. So you have 2 or 3 trunks. They're only a foot off the ground, or right there at grade. From a structural standpoint, we always consider that a structural fault. On small trees, it's not that big an issue. Like a birch tree, the strawberry tree. These aren't big trees, and so just in general, small trees don't have the really pressing issues that the big trees have, because big trees are just a much bigger hazard.
About the fig
a lot of times
tree?
the trees themselves don't want to do that, and they'll put 3 trees in one pot, especially on some of the palms, like Phoenix Robolini, the dwarf date palm. They'll put 3 together in a pot, so you'll have 3 trunks. And it's 3 separate plants, but you get that multi-trunk appearance. It just, I would never let a large tree do that. I would never want like a big 50-foot tree to have multiple trunks. That's, because it's just gonna be such a big problem once the tree's mature. But on the smaller trees, the 20, 25-foot trees, it's not that big an issue. It's very popular with several of the palms, not just the dwarf date palm, but also the king palm. You'll have to see 2 or 3 planted right next to each other. And of course, what happens when you have multiple trunk trees is those trunks tend to grow out because they're trying to get to the sun, and so they're leaning. That's not the best, it's a structural thing versus a design thing. And of course, with a small tree, it's much less of a hazard. And was there another part to that question?
Yes, the fig tree.
Fig. Plant 1 fig.
Yes.
Just plant 1, let it come up, and do what I showed you in that cartoon. Once it gets to about 4 feet, cut it off. Or 5 feet, just top it. That's going to break buds all down the trunk. Then you're going to pick the ones that you want. 4 or 5 scaffolds you're going to let get big. And then, because figs, you can use that open center pruning technique. Now you can do that at any height you want. You can let the fig get 10 feet tall and then top it and develop your scaffolds there. It's your choice. Remember, fruit trees in general, but not so much figs. Fruit trees, especially the stone fruits, are short-lived trees. 15, 20 years in most cases. So if you're growing peaches and nectarines and plums, don't expect these to be in your landscape for decades and decades and decades. Avocados and citrus, they can grow in your garden for 100 years. There are 100-year-old citrus groves still in the San Gabriel Valley. Some of those trees don't look so good, but they're still producing. When you're pruning a fruit tree, don't worry too much. Even if you do it a little wrong, it's the world's not going to end, and the tree will do fine. And then also, if you've got a very old stone fruit in your garden, or a very old fruit tree, or any old tree that's in terrible shape with dead branches and leaning, and some people won't cut down a tree like that until it's 100% dead. No, my advice is get rid of bad-looking trees and plant new trees, train them, and have a beautiful tree. A close friend of mine had this horrible orange tree in his backyard for decades. And every time I go to his yard, I say, cut that tree down. It's got a canker in the trunk. It's only got 1 live branch, and it took him forever to cut it down. If he'd cut that down when I told him, he could have grown a whole new tree there before he eventually got to it. So remove your horrible looking trees and put in new ones. For me, one of the great joys of trees is watching a young tree grow. I love putting in a young tree. And then every couple of years, I'm out there just, shaping it, removing crossing branches, overlapping branches, when they're little tiny things. I love to prune trees with hand shears. And using my chainsaw, well, that's mostly for cutting up logs for my fire pit.
Great. So Jerry Gregory asks, alcohol being scarce, what else is good for cleaning pruning shears in between cuts?
Well, alcohol shouldn't be scarce anymore. It was there at the beginning of the year because of this whole pandemic thing. But Lysol works quite well, and you can get the spray can of Lysol. And after you make a cut, you can clean the shears with the Lysol. Now, some people think you have to do that on every tree you work on, and that's not true. You do it specifically for Fireblight, and you might do it, I'm trying to think what else you do it for. In general, you don't have to do that. And when you have a pear with a lot of dead branches, spraying your shears after every cut, you end up, it's all over your hands, it's all over, your gloves are soaking wet, and it's just a mess. And that's not the easiest thing, to get all those dead branches out of a pear that hasn't been pruned for 10 or 20 years. But
what about, Jerry, what about bleach? Does that work?
bleach is very effective, but it will wreck your shoes. Bleach will, will hit the steel and it'll rust. But bleach, as far as bleach is concerned, if you're cleaning a surface and you want to kill everything on the surface, a 5% bleach solution works wonderful. And a lot of people, especially the orchid hobbyists, who are scared to death of viruses, a lot of the viruses are mechanically transmissible. And so when they always keep their pruning shears either in Lysol or alcohol, or they'll even maybe, I don't know, if you use bleach, you're going to wreck your shears. And if you buy expensive shears, that's not the best thing to do. But you should, actually, the alcohol should be available again by now.
Okay. Someone asked how to prune lemon trees. There are a couple people interested in that.
Okay, lemon trees are vigorous growers. They water sprout like crazy. So periodically throughout the whole year, you should go out and be removing those water sprouts. And they're vertical shoots off a horizontal branch. And then you want to keep it to about 12 to 15 feet. You don't use the open center. You actually prune it just like a shade tree. You want, you're going to go in and select your, pick your scaffolds. It's different if you move in and you've got a big lemon tree, it's already there. Now you try and just shape it and end up with a symmetrical tree. I've seen them, they'll get to 25 feet if you never prune them. That's way too big for picking the fruit and probably, using up the space in your garden. You don't need a 25-foot lemon. One lemon tree will produce enough lemons for 4 families. So, one of the very popular things now is to get the multiple grafted citrus. So on one a tree, you've got lemon, lime, orange, and maybe a tangerine or something. And there's 4 grafts on it. Those are really fun. If you do get that, remember to put the lemon when you plant it, make sure the lemon part is on the north side of the tree. It's the most vigorous growing of all the citrus. And you want to have it on the north side, and the slower growing one should be on the south side. And then if you have multiple grafted, you're gonna constantly be trying to restrain the fastest growing ones to let the other ones so that you don't lose the other ones. But lemons, I go in, I remove the dead wood, especially an old established tree, get rid of all the dead wood, get rid of crossing branches. I would remove maybe 20 to 30% of the green wood, probably if it hasn't been pruned for years, then you probably will be removing more than you would normally remove. And then I would try and make sure I keep it to about 15 feet.
Would you prune an orange tree in the same way as a lemon?
Yes, in fact, citrus in general, avocados, they're all pruned that way.
Okay.
On
So
the commercial, production, they do crazy stuff. But that, these trees still have an ornamental value in your garden. So you don't do some of the commercial techniques. They actually have these giant spinning blades that they drive down the aisles of orange trees, and just looks like an airplane engine. I think it's a terrible practice, but it saves them time and money. And you'll see the lemons just sheared off with these giant blades. That's done to save. It's an agricultural practice and not recommended for homeowners. To just shear the top off your tree, shape it, select your branches, because you want it to look nice in your landscape as well as produce fruit.
Okay. Jerry, Gregory asks, I have 2 carrot woods in my parkway that need professional pruning attention. May I rely on LA County to do a good job on the pruning, or should I hire a private professional pruner?
Well, generally, the county gets vendors to do that pruning. They're kind of quick. They get a per tree fee. Sometimes they're pruning very poorly. Sometimes they prune okay. They probably wouldn't do what you want done to the tree. You're going to want it to be thinned out nicely so you can see the canopy a little bit, see the major branches, so it's not real thick. If that's what you want to have happen. Generally, you're not supposed to prune your street trees on your own. Technically, if you're pruning a street tree, you're supposed to do all this stuff to let the county know that the person you hired has insurance and all this stuff. Of course, no one knows what goes out on these. The reality is there's no enforcement of that. If you hire someone to prune those, you could get one of the reputable tree services and have them do it. It's an expense you shouldn't have to bear because the county has an obligation to prune those trees. But if you call the county public works and say, hey, I want my small carrot woods pruned, you may wait years for them to show up because that's not going to be a high priority for them. They've got full-size trees that may be 30, 40 feet that are probably more pressing for them to prune. There's been a lot of issues about Edison pruning up in Altadena for the power lines. And you mentioned that Kathy Musial's on your committee. And Kathy and Rebecca Lata and some of the people from the Arboretum are constantly trying to get Edison to not top these big deodars that are under power lines, to not do severe pruning of oaks that are close to power lines. And sometimes you go up there and you wonder, what were they thinking? The power line's not even that close to the tree, and they've severely pruned the tree. So I forget what the question was now. I've digressed so far.
Well, whether he should hire a professional. And I would say the risk to hiring his own professional, paying for it, is that the county may come by and prune those trees anyway and prune them badly.
Oh, no, it's usually vendors. The county doesn't actually prune them themselves. It's all vendors. So they hire Arbor Care or National, these various Asplund, these big companies, and all they do is street trees. All they do is contract with municipal governments to trim street trees. They get paid a fee per tree. They tend not to spend a lot of time per tree. And now they would probably, if you already trimmed them and they look nice, they just drive by them.
Yeah.
And then bill the county for it.
Okay, here's a question from Deborah. I have a failing olive. It is over 100 years old. Would love your opinion on how to manage it as it slowly fails.
Most likely your olive is infected with bacterial leaf scourge. Bacterial leaf scourge goes back 100 years or more in California. It started in the 1880s on grape. It's known as it was then known as mystery disease of grape or Anaheim disease. It was down in the Anaheim area along the river there. About 40 wineries all the grapes died. They all went out of business. It was believed, it then became known as Pierce's disease of grape because Pierce worked on it in the 1890s. He thought it was a virus. It wasn't a virus, it's bacteria. The bacteria is called Xylella fastidiosa. And so proven to be.
I had the tree, a few years ago, I had the tree tested for bacterial leaf scourge. It does not have bacterial leaf scourge, apparently. I don't know if that's true or not, but it was tested. The thing that I'm more worried about is it is a failing tree, and I know that the olive wood is really hard. And we're just trying to figure out how to manage it as it slowly fails. So it has 3 main trunks. The third trunk is branched, 2 major branches off the third trunk. One trunk has already failed and we've cut it back to some safer degree, but still left it up. But the trunk that has 2 co-leaders, there's bark that has come off the one branch, and there's a split going down that trunk. Now there's still life in that, and do we cut the whole thing off? I mean, we do have expert tree trimmers come in. We've had lots of people try to give us advice, but I'd love your opinion on what would you do with a
Sounds
tree?
like that tree is a candidate for removal entirely. So I just have a couple questions.
Hmm.
So you had branches started dying on the dead trunk.
Right.
Did you notice it, like one dead branch and then a few months later, another dead branch?
Little by little by little.
Okay,
Little
well,
by little.
Your test came out negative, but your symptoms are, almost guarantee you've got scorch.
Yes, it does seem like the symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch.
Absolutely of scorch. And scorch is just going nuts in the San Gabriel Valley. And I saw scorch for the first time on olive at the Malibu State Park, or the Adams House State Park in Malibu. And they had these old olives, 100 years old. And when I got there, they were defoliated and pretty much dead. They had one branch left with the leaves. I collected 12 samples, sent them to the state. 8 came back positive, 4 came back negative. But I'm sure all the samples should have been positive. We had a similar thing with lilac up in the Antelope Valley. They were growing them for their flowers, samples into the state. They all came back negative. Samples were sent to UC Riverside. They all came back positive. So I wouldn't put a whole bunch of faith in your negative test. Your symptoms seem to indicate you've got scorch. If the trunk is split, if you're sloughing bark, this is a tree that's dying. It's in severe decline. I wouldn't spend any money trying to save it. I would spend the money cutting it down and putting in a new tree. Currently, I don't recommend you even grow olives anymore because they die from scorch.
Yeah,
and they're dying everywhere.
Just historic trees, but this was an olive plantation put in at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century.
So you've got a real
yeah, they're really old. Now, here is another question for you. If I cut it all the way back, it's got a big hollow in the middle. Can I leave the base of that and then plant a tree inside that big hollow, or is that not a good idea?
Oh, I wouldn't do that.
Okay.
There's always in addition to having scorch, which it is likely that it does have it, there's our old pathogens that kill trees, like oak root rot fungus and Phytophthora root rot. So generally, when you remove a tree that's dying or dead, you grind the stump, and then you plant your replacement tree maybe 5 to 10 feet away, or as far away as is practical. And again, I've had this argument with people who sell olive trees. I would not replant an olive.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't plant an olive. I was thinking more of no.
That I told Ann that you shouldn't be distributing. Liquid amber, the flowering plum, like purple leaf plum. I grow fruiting plums because even if they die, they're only 10, 15-year-old. They'll live for 10, 15 years. So crepe myrtle, oleander. It started in oleander in 1990. And then the 5th is, what did I leave off? Liquid amber, olive, plum, crepe myrtle, and oleander. Those are the 5 that currently I would not grow at all, or any new ones. If you've got healthy ones, you don't cut down healthy trees. It's interesting. I don't see the crepe myrtles dying a lot in the San Gabriel Valley, but if I go down to Orange County, I see them dying everywhere down there. Okay. So why it's one way in one community or another, but if you're sloughing bark, if you've got dying branches, and if the tree doesn't look good anymore, I mean, that's up to you what it looks like in a way. That sounds like a tree that should just be removed and you should put in a new tree.
Okay, Jerry and Deborah, thank you. We have a few more questions we have to address. We have a question about espalier. Celine asks, can you espalier all fruit trees? I'm interested in planting jujubes and don't know if I can do them along a fence. And after this, we have a couple more questions also.
Okay, you should be able to espalier virtually anything. So the problem I've seen for some espalier, now typically you're going to want to face west or south, because if you face north, you're not going to have enough sun to get good fruit production. And east would probably be okay, but you got to be careful that the branches are protected from the full sun when you do espalier. And I've seen people put in espalier, and then on the western side, the sun is setting, and the base of the trunk just gets fried and burnt, and then you've got a wound, and it gets infected with a fungus. And so, wounds are always susceptible to decay. So you should be able to espalier it fairly easily. You can espalier it on a piece of wooden lattice. There's a bunch of ways to support those. You know, it comes up, you know, you plant your plant. You're just going to pick the branches on the sides. You're going to cut off the branches that are coming towards you or towards away from the, you know, the vertical, that plane. I've seen apples grown espalier. I've seen, in fact, apples espalier is done even in commercial production. It you know, makes it easier to pick, a good yield. No, you should be able to espalier virtually almost anything.
Okay, great. And then we had two people interested in asking a question on lime trees. They both have lime trees that don't produce. One of the lime trees used to produce a lot and now doesn't produce anymore, or just a few each year. And the other person has a relatively new tree, only 4 years old, and it hasn't started. What is this? It has gone through several. It's been moved around a bit. It's growing but not producing. So what are their problems?
Okay, well, anytime you're having a problem with either the growth rate of a tree or flower production, or fruit production, you have to look at how you're taking care of that tree. Everything you're doing to that tree. Number one, how are you watering the tree? You know, citrus should be watered once a month in the spring and the fall, and every 2 weeks in the summer. That's an established tree. A new tree, of course, is watered once a week for the first year to a year and a half. And then in the second and third years, you're watering every 2 weeks in the spring and the fall, go back to once a week in the summer. By the 5th year, 6th, you know, your tree's growing, it's established. You're watering once a month in the spring and the fall, every 2 weeks in the summer. And when you water, you soak the tree. You give it you know, you water landscapes by the inch, just the way you measure rainfall. When you're watering a tree, you're going to give it 3 to 4 inches, an established tree. You're going to give it 3 to 4 inches of water. So you can soak the soil to a depth of 2 feet or maybe deeper. If you're just, you know, so if you're not watering right, nothing's going to go right. If some people call me up, their tree's doing very badly, how often do you water? Oh, the tree gets plenty of water. Well, really? How do you water? So, you know, some people just stand there with a hose and spray the soil for 5 minutes. That didn't water your tree. It takes a couple hours to soak a tree. So, you know, if you sit there and spray the soil for 5 minutes, then take a trowel and dig in the soil. You watered a 1/4 inch of soil, 1/2 inch of soil. That's going to all evaporate and be gone tomorrow. It's like not watering the tree at all. You've got to use a soaker hose. You make a basin. You put out a sprinkler and put out a coffee cup and run, you know, turn it on low so it just sprays under the tree. Run it till there's 3 or 4 inches in the coffee cup. That'll give you a really deep soak. Your soaker hose, you run it, and every hour probe the soil with a rod. Once you can push that rod into 2 feet, you've run your soaker hose long enough. That may take 4 hours. It may take 8 hours. It just depends on how much you turn on the hose, what kind of soaker hose you're using. I use basins a lot on my fruit trees. Big basin around the tree. I fill it up, and then I turn the hose down to a trickle. Come back in a 1/2 hour, fill it up again. Turn it to a trickle. Come back in a 1/2 hour, fill it up again. I want a deep soak. Then, you know, in the spring, in April, I do that once. March, April, May, I'm doing it once. June, I might do it after 3 weeks. But by, you know, August, September, I'm doing it every 2 weeks because, you know, your water needs go up when it gets hot, obviously. So how are you watering the tree? Next thing are you fertilizing? These are fruit trees. You want to fertilize your trees 3 times a year, spring, summer, fall. Is it in a lawn? Are you watering it 3 times a week? On the old one, now citrus can get oak root rot fungus. And a lot of times when fruit trees get oak root rot fungus, they stop making fruit. So there's a possibility, and if you're in Altadena, just like anywhere in the San Gabriel Valley, even more so really, oak root rot is a big, big problem. Now it takes years for it to really, you know, kill trees. If it gets on a young tree, it'll trash it quickly. If it gets on, you know, if an old tree, you know, tree grows for 20 years, 30 years, and then gets infected, well, then it takes forever, a long time to really damage the tree. The stone fruits are highly susceptible. Peach trees often die within a few years of infection. But citrus is actually very tough. My Washington navel I had in my backyard, I grew it for about 10 years, and then it died on me. It was oak root rot fungus. Okay, and it's killed a bunch of things in my neighborhood. It killed all the oaks in my dad's yard next door. They were big, full-sized oaks. Over about a 30, 40-year period, they all died. So, you know, it's hard to know exactly why your trees aren't flowering and producing fruit. but you got to look at how you water, if you're fertilizing, you want to water correctly, not too often, and you don't want to let them go bone dry. If you let fruit trees go bone dry, especially in the spring, they may not flower much. They may drop their flowers before they set fruit. If it goes drought stressed after it sets fruit, it's going to drop all its fruit. So it's probably a cultural problem, and not really, it's most likely cultural, but it may also involve a root disease. The old lime, I would prune it this winter. I would probably prune it pretty hard. Get in there and do a lot of pruning, a little more than I would normally do, because pruning stimulates new growth. New growth flowers more and produces more fruit. So you do want to prune and thin, and maybe on a tree that's not producing, try and reinvigorate it through pruning. But make sure you get a citrus avocado food, fertilize spring, summer, fall, water properly. And the other thing you can do that's really good is spread mulch, 4 inches of compost on the surface of the soil all around the tree. And even better is to include gypsum. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. Get gypsum, put down a 1/4 inch of gypsum on the surface of the soil, all underneath the tree, and then cover it with about 4 inches of compost. This is actually how you suppress Phytophthora root rot. The best thing you can do for a tree, the best thing you can do for a tree is water correctly. The second best thing you can do is mulch it. Put down a thick layer, 2 to 4 inches of compost, but not up against the trunk. Leave a circle around the trunk, maybe 6 inches, where there's nothing up against the trunk.
Great, Jerry, thank you.
Full sun, by the way. One other caveat is that fruit trees in the shade are not going to produce well. Fruit trees need all day sunshine. So put them where they get the sun in the morning all day and into the afternoon, and then you'll get your best production.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. That's all the time we have for questions. There are a couple of unasked questions, so we'll try to answer those privately. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jerry, for a great presentation and great Q&A. And I look forward to seeing you all November 7th for a tree planting demonstration. Thank you all. Goodbye.